We're going to get started in just a minute, but I just wanted to give you a few instructions before we begin. We are recording in several ways today. We do have some folks joining us from some other campuses. We have some folks joining us online, so just remember to mute your mic, turn off your camera until the discussion is open. For comments and questions, you can always put your question in chat, which I have opened in the meeting. And we'll unmute your mic for if you are joining us online for questions. If you take turns commenting from other campuses, if you have comments, one go at a time, and I've already let the host know which order that will go in. Make sure if you're coming in right now to sign in the back and grab a program. And if you are joining online with a phone, make sure you put your name into chat so we can get your attendance. At the end of this presentation discussion, we will be giving you a QR code and a link that you can get into and fill out a little survey to give us some feedback on the discussion. So now I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Library and Services and Catherine Lefevre, and she'll introduce our speaker.
Thank you. All right, so good afternoon and welcome to this Kentucky Reads event at SKYCTC, where we are going to discuss the book Dear Anne by Bobbie Ann Mason. My name is Catherine Lefevre, and I'm the Director of the Learning Commons, which includes the library and tutoring services. So this semester, the Learning Commons partnered with the Arts and Humanities Division to bring the Kentucky Humanities Kentucky Reads program to our campus. Some of our English instructors and one psychology instructor incorporated the book into their courses this semester. And we received a generous donation from the Service One Credit Union, which was used to purchase copies of the book for the students enrolled in the participating classes. So Kentucky Humanities is an independent nonprofit affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities in Washington, D.C. Kentucky Humanities is supported by the National Endowment and private contributions. They are not a state agency, but are proud partners with Kentucky's cultural, heritage, arts, and tourism agencies. And their mission is to tell Kentucky's story, because everyone has a story to tell, and everyone can learn from the stories of others. This year, they are celebrating 50 years of supporting humanities programming in the Commonwealth. And the Kentucky Reads program is one that they started in 2018, and it was started to generate statewide conversations about the themes in the books selected each year. And for 2022, they selected Dear Anne by Bobbie Ann Mason, who is a Kentucky native and an award-winning author. And so to lead our discussion today is Dr. Diane Calhoun-French. Diane graduated from Bellarmine College. She received her master's degree from Wake Forest University and her PhD from the University of Louisville. She joined the faculty at the Jefferson Community College in 1981, and in 2002, she was appointed its first provost, vice president for academic affairs, a position she held until her retirement in 2021. Diane was also a professor of English and Women and Gender Studies, frequently teaching at the Kentucky Correctional Institute for Women. She has been active in local, state, regional, and national organizations. She is a past president of the National Association for Women in Education and the National Popular Cultural Association. She continues to be very active with the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, SAC-COC. Her teaching and research interests include women's studies, popular culture studies, writing, and mystery fiction. She is a statewide speaker for the Kentucky Humanities Council and regularly publishes and presents papers on subjects in literature, mystery fiction, and women's studies. She has also led a book discussion group in Shepherdsville since 1985, and they have read more than 300 books together. Her passions are reading, especially murder mysteries and women's literary fiction, collecting fine arts and crafts, and everything English. She lives in Louisville with the world's most personable cats, Peanut, Little Goose, Simba, and Goblin. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you. I should tell you that 2 weeks ago, since I wrote this introduction, I lost Peanut. So we're still, I know we're still, but kitten lust is upon me again. So we'll probably add someone. It is so nice to be here with you. Can we dim these lights at all so they can see that better? And I want to start out by telling you a little bit about me, because I think it's relevant to this particular book. I went to Catholic schools, Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, Bellarmine College, which when I was there 3 years was Bellarmine Ursuline College, Catholic schools, lived at home all the way through college. And when I went to graduate school for the first time in my life, I went away to Wake Forest University, which is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I was an English major. And when I read this book, I felt like, oh my gosh, that's my life. That's me. Now, I didn't have all the experiences that she had, thank goodness. But this was a book. This was the first book I think I ever read where I actually felt like she was talking about some of the wonderful experiences and the confusing experiences that I had when I first went away, lived in an apartment on campus with another student, a PE major, so trust me, we had nothing in common. But the whole idea of immersing yourself in learning and being with other students that are constantly quoting things, and they're living and breathing in this kind of closed-in atmosphere. I mean, that was what I experienced. My first semester, we were assigned, I had to read 32 novels and write 16 papers. So that's all that you literally had time to do. So I love this book for the reason that it says something to me about my life. But I know that the audiences that we have here and the audiences that we have in the other classrooms may find the experience of this extremely different from their own experience. And I'm real interested to see what all of you think about it. It doesn't mean that I think the book is perfect. It is just that in some ways it's perfect for me. Now, let me say just a word about the idea of Kentucky Reads is to talk about Kentucky authors. But more than that, it is to talk about somehow the Kentucky experience. So let's see if I can go to the next one. These are the books that we've had so far in this series. And I don't think they've announced it publicly, but the book for next year, which I think everybody's going to really enjoy, has been selected. And I just wanted you to see, this is Bobbie Ann Mason's website where she puts the copy of Dear Anne. I love it, of course, because it has a cat on it. But I just want to start out here by looking at that bird for a minute that is on the cover. And I have to say, this is the 4th time that I've read this book, because I've done 4 of these talks, and each time I read it beforehand. And I discovered some new things I hadn't thought of before. And what struck me about the cover they chose is, look at that bird. It's a blue bird, and it's got realistic feathers, eyes, beak, head. But notice how the bottom of it becomes almost something that's been painted on. It's got a pattern. And I think that's a little bit like this book, where part of it is real and part of it is created. And I think that's one of the, for me, the challenges of this book. Oh, okay, we can go to the next one. Oh, there we go. I wanted to read you this quotation. This is near the end of the book, where Anne has settled into what she's doing, living in Kentucky, writing this book. And as she's experiencing driving the Mustang that Jimmy has left her, which he has left her, and now she has her own. This is what it says. A pale bluebird, a female, kept attacking her own image on the side view mirror of the Mustang. She perched on the arm of the mirror and pecked around, then returned to the mirror and flailed at herself, then hopped back to the metal arm. She was seeking a nest site. Anne moved the car several times before the bluebird gave up and sought a new place to dwell. It never struck me really until the other night when I was reading this book again, that Anne is sort of that bird. You remember when she comes back to Kentucky, she has written this memoir, and it eventually is called You Are a Bluebird. And so this idea of a bird that's looking at itself in a mirror, looking for a place to make a nest, to find a home, and yet who can't comfortably seem to do that, and eventually moves on. And I think that's a really interesting kind of metaphor for what happens to Anne. There's another quotation in the book where she's talking about how she gets through the trauma that she's experienced with Jimmy. And she says, Mama was the key. Without her, Anne wouldn't have survived Jimmy. Mama had a way of laying things bare, naming what was true. Mama said, when you finally told us about Jimmy, your feathers just fell. So there's the image again of her as a bird trying to survive and not being able to do that. So think about those things as we consider this. I know many of you studied Bobbie Ann Mason. Obviously, she was reared here in Kentucky on a dairy farm. Interestingly enough, she traveled while she was a teenager as the president of a fan club for a pop quartet, the Hilltoppers. I assume that group was based someplace here. Anybody remember them, the Hilltoppers? And so even though she's very much an introverted person, traveling around as the president of their fan club, I think might have been interesting. She graduated from UK. She moved to New York. She worked for a lot of popular magazines. She received her master's from SUNY Binghamton. And of course, Binghamton, we know, is the actual location of graduate school, as opposed to the California that she dreams about. And she became, for 1 year, an assistant professor of English at a state college. But it just wasn't for her. Teaching wasn't for her. And finally, in 1979, she began writing full-time. And as you know, she has been very, very successful, winning the National Book Award, the Southern Book Award, the Ernest Hemingway Foundation Award. She's often won Kentucky Book Awards, grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, and her memoir was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. So she is very much has been very much involved since the late 70s in writing, and many of her books are set in Kentucky. So this is me reading this book. I don't know where my hair went, but, and I wanted to say something about how I approach a book. When I'm reading it, I'm constantly questioning the author. What did you mean when you said that? Or the author will say, somebody said sarcastically. And if that doesn't ring true to me, I'm questioning, what do you mean sarcastically? Why is that character being sarcastic? And so there are really, I think, kind of two sets of questions about this novel that I just want to share with you to kind of get your perspective. The first are the questions that I ask as I read, and some of them still bother me because I'm not sure of the answers. And some of them are the kind of general questions that I think anybody would ask about a book that's been chosen for this topic. So let's talk about some of my questions. This is my first question, and it's my most important question. What is the truth about what happened in Anne's past? And does it matter? Is that a question that any of you ask yourselves as you read it? What's the actual truth? What is it that happened? And what is it that didn't happen? Anybody bothered by that as they read it? That lack of certainty? That to me was an issue. I constantly wanted to know what is real and what is she making up? And if you're a certain kind of reader, that is probably something that bothered you. And every time I read this book, I notice, particularly in the letters, that something will slip in. Like, for instance, one of the letters that Jimmy writes mentions Binghamton. That's the first time I've noticed it, where he brings in the place where they actually knew each other. So I think that's the first question. And then the question of, does it matter? Does it matter if we know how much of this is, quote, real for Anne, and how much is something that she makes up essentially out of kind of thin air? So I'll be interested to see what you think about that. My second question is, why use the letter form? Obviously, she uses the epistolary form, that is the using letters. And we have letters from Jimmy, letters from Mama, one letter from Chip, and one or two letters from her professor. So that's a curious choice. And I think it makes a real difference in how we read this novel. So let's keep that question in mind for a minute. And then, what's the function of all these other people in this book? The people who are her teachers, her psychiatrist, whom frankly I thought was a snotty person. I didn't care for him at all. The other graduate students that she's in class with, especially the boys, she says, who think they know everything and who kind of make fun of her approach to what she's doing. And how does the function of her, what is the function of her family? Because obviously we only have one person, Mama, speaking for her family. But yet we know about other things going on in the family. Another question that I ask, and I'll have to see what your general opinion is, why did Jimmy join the Army? And in what way was the acid trip somehow involved in that? Let me ask you, just for a show of hands, how many of you thought it was credible that this student who had a full scholarship here at Stanford would give it up and join the Army knowing he'd be sent to Vietnam. I didn't find that a credible thing at all when I was reading it. When I was in college, the Vietnam War was going on. I remember I had professors who were really torn about giving grades to students, knowing that students might get a bad grade, might flunk out of Bellarmine, and then might be drafted. So it was a very real thing. But I have to really question that particular thing. That's still one of my questions after 4 times of reading this novel. Then another question, why do you think there are so many specific references to things in this novel? You know, the individual song titles, the album titles, the things like the kind of dishes they use, descriptions of the bathrooms, and you know how Pixie puts pebbles all over hers. You know, why do we have so much detail? And is it meaningful? Does it get in the way? What's the function of it? Then for me, a big question is, how is what Anne is reading as a graduate student, how is that affecting the way she thinks about things? How is the fact that she is, you know, everybody's listening to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band when it comes out and going over the lyrics microscopically, you know, how do those things make a difference for her and change her? And then, is it realistic for Anne to want the real thing? You know, she tells the psychiatrist, I want the real thing. And I guess one of my questions is, does she get it? And then what about the fact that we see the adult Anne in relationship to her husband of 40 years, so a long-term marriage? And by the way, do you remember the names of the daughters? Anybody remember the names of the daughters? One is named for Emily Dickinson, who's throughout the novel, and the other is Janice, spelled Janis, for Janis Joplin. So you know it's clear that these things have affected her deeply. And I guess the last question there is, would she have been happy? Jimmy hadn't been killed in Vietnam, and she had married him. Would she have had a happier life than the life that she has? Now, I think some of the general questions that we're encouraged to ask about this book, and it's interesting, I've gotten different replies to this. Why was this book chosen to be the Kentucky Reads selection? Well, obviously, she's a renowned Kentucky writer, born in Kentucky, lives in Kentucky. It's the 50th anniversary of the Kentucky Humanities Council, and this book is set 50 years ago in 1972. But in what ways does it speak about the experience of being a Kentucky person? And is it complimentary of Kentucky? You know, when Mama writes those letters, how are we supposed to feel about Mama and feel about the things that she describes and are important to her? And then, of course, the big question, what happened in the story? Can we synopsize it? Whenever I'm teaching a novel, that's the first thing I say to students is, can you tell me what happened? Because it's getting harder and harder with contemporary novels to actually be able to say at the end what happened. I voraciously read murder mysteries, and I have noticed that very few of them now start at the beginning and go to the end. Instead, you'll have something happen and it'll flash forward or it'll flash back. You'll have 2 or 3 different time periods going on at the same time. And so we are making things more and more complex. So one of the first questions to me is, can I actually say what happened? And obviously with this novel, where we're dealing with not only supposedly a real past that she has, but a past that she has to try and imagine for herself. The next one really is kind of back to the Jimmy questions. Is it credible that the characters act the way they do? Is it credible that Jimmy would have joined the military and given up his deferment? Is it credible that Anne would do the things that she does in the novel in terms of changing and fitting in with what she sees in graduate school? Then, of course, we always say, what is it about, what's worthy of discussion in this book? Is it the style, the story? Is there something about the way the narrative is put together? And this one is very interesting, of course, because we have the setting of Anne on the ship with her husband on a cruise, probably his last cruise, probably the last few months of his life. And most of the time that we see her, she is thinking back and rewriting her history. And we see even that she carries that letter of Jimmy's with her. And she talks about her marriage and says it was a good marriage. It worked out well, but there's not the same passion. And then I guess the question of, how does the story interact with your life? I think this is a big question for us as readers. There are certain kinds of books I just don't want to read because somehow the subject of the book is not particularly interesting to me. This, as I mentioned, was actually a book that spoke so closely to my own experience that I was able to really know how she felt and feel a lot of what she felt. But I have found, we did a talk like this at Jefferson, most of the people at Jefferson who read the book really couldn't identify very much with that. And so they didn't really find this book that compelling or moving. Okay, go next. What does the main character learn in this story? One of my favorite graduate professors used to always say, that's one of the first questions to ask yourself is, what does the main character learn? If you're looking for why someone writes a book or what kind of insight they might like you to get, that's always a way to start. And obviously one of the things that this book is that kind of novel of education. It's like Great Expectations or David Copperfield, books about growing up and how one becomes educated into being an adult. And certainly that is part of this novel. And then are there particular incidents or passages or details that strike you as important? And I will tell you, for me, I thought the most telling detail in this whole book, remember when Anne is in class and they're reading the book that has the quotation, the worm loves the plow or something like that, accepts the plow. And everybody's trying to give it all these interpretations. And Anne said, well, you know, where I grew up, if you cut a worm in two, all it does is make two worms. So why wouldn't a worm be happy if you plowed right through it? Because it's now two of itself instead of one. And everybody makes fun of her for having that answer, the answer that comes from her life experience. But everybody else thinks it's funny. That one to me was a very significant passage. How does the story reflect or comment or criticize the historical period? You know, what did you, as you read it, what did you come away thinking about the 70s? Did you find the characters to be self-indulgent? Did you find the 70s to be over the top, ridiculous? Or is there something that you found in it that you liked or that you admired? I'm curious to know. And does this book want to make you read anything else by Bobbie Ann Mason? I think that's always a question as well. So let me stop there and see if we have some questions or comments in the chat.
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
So you can probably take questions from the audience in here.
Okay, anybody have a reaction to any of these questions that I posed that the book had for me? First of all, if I ask you, how many of you thought this was a good book, whatever a good book means to you? People who liked reading it. Okay, that's pretty good. Tell me why. What did you like about it?
And for those of us in the room, we do use the catch box so that our folks in the other rooms can. So just throw it. And you can throw that.
That seems amazing to me. So, why did you like it? What struck you as good?
I just like the story overall, you know, because I find myself reflecting a lot on what my life would be like now if I had done this, if I had done that, you know, so I could just really relate there.
So when you say that, it's not so much the particular experience she had you relate to, but just the fact that when we get to a certain age, we look back at the road not taken, right, and say, boy, how would my life have been different if I had done such and such? Yeah. Other people who liked this book.
Yeah. Thank you. So one comment was that he felt like the book was more about the 60s than the 70s, and then someone else gave a thumbs up. So maybe the representation of the time period was a little shifted from this, you know, more 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm. And let me just ask that question further. So in other words, is the issue that the book is more about a time period, a period of time, and is that the main thing that's important about it, or is it just that the person thinks that's the main thing the story has about it, is that time period?
Okay. So we're asking how important was the time period?
Mr. Turner.
Yeah.
Mr. Turner, if you want, please feel free to just unmute yourself, and you and Dr. Calhoun-French can talk back and forth.
Yeah, hang on.
Hang on just a second, Mr. Turner.
He's unmuted. So, Jim, if you want to, he can't hear me though. Jim, if you want to talk, you can.
I mean, did you think there was too much about the late 60s and early 70s Was that distracting from like what you wanted to know about the characters and how they felt?
I'm not sure he's coming through.
Okay. How about the rest of you? Did you
Now, try this. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was more interested in the time period because I lived it both the 60s and the 70s, but I thought the biggest event in the book was when they went to the big rally in San Francisco, and that changed everything, and that was 67, wasn't it?
I don't know specifically what year.
Yeah, I didn't find much 70s in there. I thought it was during from 65 to 69 that this all came to a head, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow. But anyway, I really the only thing I identified with in 72 was student unrest, but the rest of it I thought it was more 60s.
I think that's probably true. It's late 60s and very early 70s, but you're right. The main bulk of the novel really takes place from 67 to about 70. Yeah. What did you think about the fact that there was so much particular detail in this book? That you saw what kind of dishes they were using. You knew what kind of curtains she was making. I mean, you know, it's just all that detail about everyday life.
Well, that was what I was going to comment on, is I think that's what makes you really feel like you're there. Like, I didn't grow up in the 60s, but I loved the 60s when I was in high school. I listened to that music and studied about that era. So reading this book really made me feel like I was in that era and with everything that was going on because of her details. I could really put myself there.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that that we say is that novels, because novels have a basis, at least the history of the novel, in realism, in telling what a particular time and place and character is really like, that is going to have, in order to get that sense of realism, you really have to include all of these details that will establish what that time period is. And therefore, a lot of novels have a shelf life that's not that long. I think of the novels I was reading in the 80s. I was reading all of the Arthur Haley ones like Airports and Hotel, and you got a real, you know, you got an insider view with like the airline industry and how it worked, and hotels and how they worked. But you go back and read those now and they don't resonate much. And it's because they are so locked into those particular details. But for me, she talks about having flat-graph dishes. Does anybody know what those are? They were like the rage, you know. They have this pattern. There's a outlet in Pennsylvania where you can go buy everything from clocks and spoon rests and canisters and everything else. And she's very particular about that, and that helps establish a lot about Meredith and John, who are the characters that she knows, etc. How many of you were more interested in the love story between Jimmy and Anne than in anything else? Is that okay, can you talk about that? Okay. Yeah, anybody, if that was, why was that interesting? Is it much more the personal things that you identify with when you're reading a book, those personal emotions?
When I read books, I am just more focused on the relationship storyline. I liked all the other details that you're referring to, but I think that sets the stage for the storyline to understand it in context, but that's really what I would kind of jump to with each chapter to see what was going to happen.
Well, let me ask you, did you find it realistic that he would have gotten rid of his deferment and joined the Army?
No, I did buy into the storyline that he did it as kind of like a social justice thing where he wanted to stand up to it and be a part of it. But with the scholarship, it doesn't make sense to me. So.
And let me ask you one more relationship question here. What would you think if he had not died and she married him?
Well, I have to say, in full disclosure, I have a few pages left. So, yeah, I told my colleague here, I said, I haven't finished it, but I know I'm going to get spoilers today, and I know he's going to die. And she said, well, I don't want to tell you that he's going to die. I said, but I know he's going to.
How many of you figured just all the way through the book that he was going to die? Yeah, I did too. To me, that was one of those things. Yeah. Well, and it's very interesting the way she handles that death, because it kind of happens without her really telling you it happens. You just know that it's happened. The other thing that, I have to say is that when I read novels, I say to myself, now would that really happen in real life? The fact that she gets pregnant and then she has a miscarriage, those are the kind of things I sometimes say, is that too much? Would that really have happened? Maybe so, maybe not. So, because things that happen in life are sometimes really stranger than things in fiction. Yeah, Esther, you had a question?
Yes, so we're going to get a question from Debbie Banks online. I can, I think she can come through now. Hang on just a sec. For some reason I can't unmute her. Dang it. Oh yeah, so, okay, so Debbie, if you'll unmute yourself. And I can also ask her a question if you want me to, just let me know in chat. She was one of the ones that felt that Jimmy was somewhat authentic because he was a student, yes, but he was torn about doing nothing for anyone and sitting around doing drugs, and he felt he would never live up to his parents' expectations. So he felt the need to do something drastic. So she was saying that she felt like it did make sense for him to make that drastic choice.
Well, let me ask this question as a follow-up to her. Do you think that he regretted the decision? There's a couple of different letters, and frankly, I'm confused because two of the letters from Jimmy are dated the same day, April 1st, 1968. One of them is the one that she has that she keeps, and it's one where he says, I'm really sorry I hurt you, did all these things. So it's a little confusing to me, but do you think he was sorry he joined up after he got to Vietnam and after he realized how much that hurt her? So
Jim Turner saying, I think any of us who didn't have to go to war while our friends did had guilt bugging us to varying degrees.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's really true. And at Bellarmine, I know in the early 70s, there were a lot of veterans coming back and were very, they were very conflicted about how they felt about having been there and how they felt about the war continuing. Well, let me ask this question. What about her relationship with her husband? Did you find that you disliked her at all for her attitude toward her husband? Anybody feel that way? I mean, I have to say I was just kind of a little bit, I thought, how does he stand a chance against this guy that she loved in college and then dies when he's young and beautiful and perfect, and then she marries someone else and she lives a real life with him where you've got to deal with all kinds of things. So I'm still conflicted about her. I liked her very much and I identified with her, but there were things about the adult Anne that we hear, as opposed to the Anne of the late 60s, that I found a little distressing. We've only got about 5 minutes. I wanted to show you something. This is a quotation, because we're talking about these details. Some people criticized Bobbie Ann Mason. Somebody referred to her as a Kmart realist. And she says, I don't think of myself as a Kmart realist. I hope what I'm trying to do is more than document patterns of discount shopping in the late 20th century. Many teachers and scholars seem primarily concerned with themes and ideas, but that's not how I think. If that was what I was after, I'd write a term paper. I think more in terms of literal details and images, as well as sound and tone, all the textures that bring a story to life. Sometimes it seems I'm working mostly with sounds and rhythms, the voices in my head. I write a story over and over until it sounds right. And then another person, speaking of her, says, other critics have criticized her skill at depicting material details of her linoleum world. In other words, we don't need to know that she had a linoleum floor. This person says, but readers know precisely what the clothes are the characters are wearing, the meals, what they're spending their time doing, and the exact titles of soap operas and songs they're listening to. And this critic says, Mason is among the first to use seriously the so-called low art of popular culture as an important underpinning to the literature and lives of her characters. While she portrays the encroaching impact of urban America on her rural occupants, she usually does so as a means of providing an accurate and realistic depiction of people within their changing environments. And then I want you to notice what she herself said. She said, I've always found it difficult to start with a definite idea. But if I start with a pond that's being drained because of a diesel fuel leak and a cow named Hortense and some blackbirds flying over and a woman in the distance waving, then I might get somewhere. So for her, the beginning is never an idea that she wants to convey, but it's something that she sees, and the combination of those things that she sees that launch her story. And I think that's very much what we see Anne doing at the end of this novel, where she's immersing herself in the natural world of Kentucky, and she's listening to what that natural world with all its happenings and all its images has to say to her. So I would just conclude by saying that, on that level of realism and of grounding a story in the particular details of real life, there is nobody better. And by the way, you all know the Kentucky Museum, which you are lucky enough to have here in Kentucky. One of the things that exists, that there is in that museum, is a feather crown. So do you know about the feather crown? Bobbie Ann Mason has a wonderful novel called Feather Crowns, which is about a woman long time ago who has triplets. But a feather crown refers to something that was made 100 years ago when pillows were made of feathers. If you had someone who was an invalid and for a long, long, long time lay on a pillow. The belief was that when that person died, you could open up the pillow and their head would have made a feather crown. And the feather crown was a keepsake or a sign from them. The Kentucky Museum actually has a feather crown in it. So I encourage you sometime to go take a look at that. And I think it really supports this idea of the idea that stories grow out of objects that have meaning and significance. So anyway, thank you all for being here and for giving me another chance to read this, what's for me a very nostalgic novel. Thank you.
All right, we do have a little survey for you guys to read real fast. If you look forward to that last slide. Here we go. What you can do is hold up your phone to kind of get that QR code and just kind of get some feedback on the session. Thank you so much. And thank you.
I don't know where my top went. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Here you go, right here.
Oh, good. Okay.
Tomorrow, if you go, oh yeah, Jim Turner is also having a session tomorrow during the same middle of the day. And the link to that is in the Bite Size News and Skylight newsletter in your email.
I'm sorry we couldn't get more discussions. Just
It's all right, it's all right.
It's a hard format.
It is, but we got something, a few people online, I think they were kind of trying to figure out what they wanted to say, that this is pretty sweet.
Thank
So
you.
I don't know if you did, know Virginia Smith, who's a writer with the Blue Guys